Okay, good morning everyone. My name is Fiona Carr. I'm one of the account managers for Ingenta Connect. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for this webinar on XML typesetting. Now, just to introduce Bret Freeman, who is a Vice President, beg your pardon, for Konvertus. He's going to talk us through XML conversion this morning and why it's of benefit to you as a publisher to convert to. So, handing over to you, Bret.
Thank you, Fiona. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your time this morning and joining us for this webinar. We want to talk a little bit about XML, what XML potentially means for publishers, what XML can kind of bring to the party for you, and where the benefits are. By way of introduction, I've been involved in XML much longer than I really care to admit. I was involved in the initial DITA working group. I was involved in SGML and XML from the very early days, sort of mid to late 90s, where I used to work with sort of industrial strength content management systems, and working with various organizations across multiple vertical industries, kind of cutting our teeth on XML. So I've got a good background to give you some ideas, give you some thoughts around why it makes sense for you to look at XML and what, as I said, that sort of brings to your organization. So we'll start with sort of the nitty-gritty, and my next slide tends to sort of frighten a few people when I say, what is XML? And I actually show a piece of XML. XML is really, really ugly stuff. Thank God we don't have to look at it in this way. And essentially what XML is it's a framework or a tagging set that allows machines, computers, to understand your content. And so really what that means is we can put information around our information, and by doing that, then computers can render our information in certain ways. And whether you're looking at typical typesetting, whether you're looking at PDFs or EPUBs or any multiple of digital outputs, if your content is in XML to begin with, then that transformation becomes much, much easier because the input of the transformation becomes really predictable. So this is a journal article tagged up in XML. And this is the same journal article rendered on the internet. So the XML here has gone through a transformation of some sort and through some styles, and that style has then produced this. And so kind of if you harken back to the old days of publishing, where an author would kind of pen a manuscript on a piece of paper and would then send that paper to a typesetter, and that typesetter would then turn it into some sort of a digital medium and print it out on the book. I mean, going way back, would put it on a typesetting machine and maybe hot metal typesetter or something like that. XML is kind of going back to those roots, really, and so what it's doing is it's separating your information from your formatting, and by doing that, then it allows you to take the same piece of information and render it multiple times across multiple media, and that's really where XML kind of excels for publishers. As we've seen in the last 10, 15 years or so, with the advent of all sorts of new digital devices, whether they're iPhones or e-readers or Kindles or Nooks or iPads or any multiple tablets, output devices, any of those things. The trick is that each of those devices require a different format. And because they require a different format, then it can become very cost prohibitive for a publisher because they have to retypeset their information over and over and over again, or they have to take their PDF files and they have to convert them over and over and over again. What XML does is gives you a common language, so once you convert your content into XML, then you can simply apply a transform and get all of the other outputs. So if we look at who's using XML, as I said, I've been working with XML for quite a long time. The early adopters of XML really were in the manufacturing and technical documentation industries, people that I call accidental publishers. And so for these types of organizations, they have a publishing requirement and publishing is not necessarily their first line of business. It's not necessarily a profit center for them. It's more of a cost center, and they just simply had to be nimble and efficient at publishing. So they were the first ones really to adopt XML technologies, and for those organizations, things like multilingual content and a concept called SimShip, which means you simultaneously have to ship all of your products and all the documentation in all the languages all on the same day. So as I said, they had to be really, really proficient. And so a good thing for those industries, for us in publishing now, is because those industries have sort of cut their teeth in taking, the initial kind of heavy-duty DCDs and taking those into something called DITA, which is a bit more component-centered. And now we see things like JATS and NLM and things that really help STM publishers. So, STM is adopting XML quite rapidly, and I'll come on to some of the reasons why. Obviously, academic publishing, all sorts of academic publishing, whether it's textbooks, whether it's test center creation, whether it's any of that sort of thing, e-learning content, all of that type of information becomes really, really nimble and really easy to maneuver and manage when it's in XML. Obviously, trade publications, when you're talking about, sort of novels and typical trade books, those publishers are also starting to adopt XML simply because, as I mentioned earlier, it makes it much, much easier for content to be produced in what we call multi-channel. So a trade book can then be created in PDF. It can be created in EPUB. It can be created in any number of different output formats. Also, as you said, I won't go through each of these, but you can kind of get the idea where the law industry has added huge benefit to XML is in really what I call chunking up your content. And so what chunking your content means is making your content available at the most valuable, smallest piece of content. So for journal publishers, for instance, a journal article is very valuable because that article can be repurposed into multiple different publications, or it can be recombined or redeployed. So within the law industry, they've really kind of got this down to a fine art, because obviously law articles and pieces to do with legislation, etc., obviously can then be placed in multiple output formats, can be collected and rejoined and sold in a multiple different formats. So all of these different industries have brought something to the XML game. They've all have a different way to look at information. And as the last bullet point does, really everyone is using XML. There has been XML in our life for quite some time, and as I said, it's mostly invisible to people. When you're doing online banking or when you're doing any sort of online transaction, most likely the information that's going back and forth across the internet is some sort of XML piece of information going back and forth on a service bus and getting from one place to the next. So XML is really all around us, and publishers are now beginning to really understand all of the benefits. So why are these people using XML? And that's really what it comes down to. And so the first bullet point I've got there is improved findability. And what I mean by that is, Google's a wonderful thing, but I used to work with a guy that would say the only thing worse than a search that returns nothing is a search that returns everything, because all of a sudden you become very overwhelmed. And so what XML does is XML allows you to add what's called metadata to your information. And that metadata is quite simply information about information. And so, for instance, if you are an author, so I've written an article and my article is under the name Bret Freeman, I can then add various metadata around that article. So I can potentially put metadata around what my disciplines may be, what my education may be. I can put information about what other articles I may have written. I can put information about my location. I can put information about my education, my affiliation, my trade, anything I want. And then when Google or any other internet crawler, when the search engines start to look for information, they index XML really, really well. And so when you're doing a search for articles about XML written from the UK, chances are Bret Freeman's name will come up. Or if you're searching, likewise in a medical context, if you're searching for articles about a certain condition or about a certain case study about a certain condition, those articles that have been indexed in XML will surface first. And so from a publishing perspective, it makes a lot of sense to make your content really, really rich and really robust with XML metadata, because then your content gets surfaced much quicker, and then it actually drives usage. There's some great statistics, particularly around those Ingenta customers that are already using XML, and finding that the customers that are using XML's content is consumed up to 4 times more than that content that's not indexed in XML. So it makes a lot of sense from a publishing perspective. Obviously, the processes that you use to create your content become much more flexible and much more efficient, because again, once you start to put your content in a format that can be read by a machine, then all of a sudden automation becomes much easier, and you can start automating what are typically manual workflow tasks. You can start automating things like indexing. You can start automating things like peer review. You can start automating all sorts of stuff in the actual content creation process. And so those processes, as it says, there becomes much, much more flexible, much, much more efficient. And then I've talked about the multiple format outputs, and this is again a really key point, because as consumers today are snapping up your content, people work differently, people research differently, people interact differently with content today than they did, say, 10 years ago. So being able to output your information into multiple formats from an XML source then becomes really valuable, because you don't have to spend money again to create EPUB, again to create something that works on an iPad, again to create something that works on an Android, again to create something that works on whatever the next greatest device is. I worked a number of years ago for an organization in America, and this was, gosh, going back to probably 1999, 2000 maybe. And they put all of their content in XML, and this was pre-iPad days. This is pre-tablet days. And by getting all their content into a database and into XML, when these tablets came out, they could just all of a sudden really quickly produce these new formats, because it was just simply writing a new transform. Also, that same organization was able to create new products and new revenue streams. I was working with them during the 9/11 attacks in New York, and all of a sudden in America, what became really, really prevalent, and this particular company I was working with was a pharmaceutical society, and they produced a pharmaceutical index. So as a result of 9/11, what became really, really prominent in the news was the risk of biochemical attacks and biowarfare. Because this organization already had their content in XML, they were able to search across the metadata, and in less than 6 weeks, they were able to produce 2 new entire publications that had to do with bioterrorism drugs and bioterrorism antidotes. And it was really quick, 6 weeks from concept to actually getting the content out on the street. So again, brand new products, brand new revenue streams. From an STM perspective, if you're looking at what you can potentially do with journal articles by being able to recombine them, regroup them, and put them into new products, then again, new revenue streams become really, really easy to create. And of course, you start to think about your content not as information between pages or information on the internet, but you start to think of your content as really content assets. And combining and recombining those assets are what become really, really important. And then the last point I just want to mention there, and we're hearing a lot about artificial intelligence in publishing, what I call rise of the machines. And I think this is really, really going to impact the future. And when we look at STM, and particularly STM journal publishing, and you look at how consumers interact with content on a platform such as Ingenta, this becomes really interesting because you can also, using XML, start to catalog and understand your user's behavior. So Amazon does this really well. So if you say you go on Amazon, maybe you went on Amazon 4 years ago and you bought a can opener. I'll bet today you're still getting emails from Amazon that says you bought this can opener. You might also want to buy the matching toaster. So Amazon does that because what they're able to do is they are able to follow a user's behavior across all of their content with XML metadata, and then they can predict following behavior. Facebook does this as well. So you see somebody on Facebook might put a post that they just got married, and they might put a wedding picture, and they'll change their Facebook status to married. And then lo and behold, the next thing that this person starts to see in the Facebook ads that come up in the window panes are things for like baby equipment, like prams or bottles or whatever. Again, because they're able to track what users are doing by adding and dropping metadata. And so it again, on a platform like Ingenta, this becomes really, really interesting because if your content is tagged in XML, and if you're able to track what the users are doing and what the users are interacting with, I can say, oh, you happen to be looking at my particular journal article on this heart condition, and I see that you downloaded 2 different articles on this particular heart condition, so you must be a thoracic surgeon, and based on your profile, I'm going to look at all of those things, and oh, you might be interested in these articles as well. So as a publisher, you can start proactively selling your information to users. So, that kind of leads into, so what's in it for you as a publisher? And this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, I think. Again, we talked about repurposing and reusing your content, which is really, really important. By having XML, your content becomes sort of unleashed, if you will. You are very easily able to create and recreate and recombine and reuse and resell all of your information. I touched on the pharmaceutical company that I worked with in America. Your content becomes really future-proof because if your information is in XML, then regardless of what future standards there are, regardless of what future devices there are, regardless of any future requirements, you're able to very quickly take your content from XML to that new thing, whatever that new thing happens to be. There was a couple of years ago, there was an issue with people that had their websites, for instance, in Flash. And oh, guess what? iPhones don't use Flash. Oh, so we better convert everything to HTML5, and now an iPhone can work with HTML5. So that was something that a lot of people didn't really see coming, but guess what? People who manage their information in XML already, HTML5 was pretty easy to get to because, again, it was just another transform. So as you're looking at new devices, you're looking at new things that are coming out, as you're looking at, what does the future hold? If you're looking at how artificial intelligence is going to impact our industry, not to have your content in a format such as XML, I think is a pretty risky strategy. Whereas getting your content in XML then allows you to move forward with the times and even better yet, to be ahead of all the times. Again, I've already talked about flexibility and searchability. I'll say searchability stroke findability, and then traceability. And again, what I mean by traceability is being able to watch what your users are doing and how your users are interacting with content, so you can then predict what they're doing next. Again, just another example, Netflix does this really well, because what Netflix does is they track their user behavior, and they are one of the first streaming video companies who have now started producing their own content, and they produce that content based on users' viewing habits. So they know when they create something, it's going to be a hit because they've had, so many millions of people watching something very, very similar. They also are able to track when people watch a movie and when people turn a movie off, or when people fast forward something, or so they're really tracing user behavior. And again, I can't stress how important this is with a platform like Ingenta, because if you can track and trace what your users are doing, then you can upsell them all day long, which is the name of the game. So how do we get started? And this is kind of from a practical perspective. As I said, I've been working in XML since the beginning of XML, really, and within publishing, I hear a lot of terms being thrown out. XML-first is one, and XML-first is a concept that all of your content creators, all of your authors, anybody who has anything to do with your workflow works in XML. As I've said there, it's nice in theory, because you probably aren't going to get a seasoned doctor or seasoned PhD submit an article for publication in your journal in XML. If you do, give me a call, because I'd like to have a chat with them, because that's a pretty interesting approach. But most content creators, they don't work directly in XML to begin with. So I think XML early is probably a better definition of what happens. And so typically you will get some sort of a submission from somebody, and that submission will be in a format. It may be in Word, it may be in who knows what. It may be written on the back of a napkin. But whatever the case, there is a process to go through where is potentially peer review process. Potentially there's multiple stages of that. There's editorial and production processes. At some point, it makes sense to convert that content into XML. And if that makes sense for your organization, then, fantastic. What most publishers are doing, particularly in the STM space, is what I call XML after the fact. And that means the content, you may have content already in PDF, you may be creating PDFs, and then that PDF content you would now like to have placed into XML. And so that's where Ingenta comes in, because they've got a really, really slick conversion process that allows you to create XML from your PDF. And so from the Ingenta platform, I'll talk about this in a few slides, but really Ingenta certainly works with full text and does a fantastic job with full text, but is really optimized for HTML5, which you can get to very quickly from XML. So as you're looking at your content and you start thinking about, gee, this all sounds great, but how do I get started, and what do I do next? And I think as you're looking, particularly again for STM publishers, you're looking for structure in your content. Article is a pretty easy structure to have a look at first. So journal articles, they are a really easily reusable piece of information. So if I have a journal that's got 20 articles in it, and I have 10 years of that particular journal, I might want to recombine various articles from various journals to to produce another journal, or to make a some sort of an annual, or some sort of a specific journal that details with a specific vertical, perhaps. Again, we've got new business drivers and things to look at. So when we're looking at the rise of the machines, we're looking at artificial intelligence in publishing, or we're looking at new devices, Apple devices, Android devices, whatever the case may be. There are new drivers for your business, and obviously production costs have to continue to sort of, it's kind of a race to the bottom for production costs, really, because you've now got to produce your content in a much wider variety of formats. XML makes that really easy. I've talked about chunking your content, or what I say, organizing your content into consumable assets. And that's really, really important, because those consumable assets are the things that make your business really nimble, and make your content really, really valuable. So if we look at Ingenta Connect briefly from the publisher's perspective, and I think many, if not all of you on the webinar today are already Ingenta Connect customers. So you know how Ingenta Connect works. But what I really want to talk about is the power that you have once you have converted your content into XML. As I said, with Ingenta being optimized for HTML5 and HTML5 being really easy to get to from XML, your content performs much, much better for you in an XML format than it would if it were in plain text. So things to think about there, and start to think about the sort of metadata that you can add and the sort of things that you can do with and in and around your content. And it makes it much, much easier and much, much more efficient for you as a publisher. And so, the good news is Ingenta now has the ability to convert your content to XML from PDF. And with this service, then you're able to leverage all of the benefits of everything that I've been talking about, and essentially, they've got Ingenta now has what I loosely term here as an XML factory, which produces your content in XML, and then that XML can go into a content output factory, which is a group of transformations that can get you to HTML5, can get you to EPUB, can get you to any other format that you desire. So, how do we do this? And just to sort of wrap up here, XML conversion with Ingenta definitely adds value to your content. When your content is in XML, it becomes much easier to handle. It becomes much easier to use. As I've said there, it allows you to find new revenue streams within your content. It allows you to upsell your existing customers, perhaps. It allows you to recombine your existing content into new publications that you can potentially resell. Ensures findability, which I talked about also, which is really, really important that your content, as somebody is searching the vast World Wide Web, you want your content to bubble up first. So you want to ensure that your content is in an indexable form, or in a form that's indexed the best by the search engines, and XML does that. I talked about future-proofing your content regardless of what the next greatest thing is, or what the brave new world looks like for us, and we don't necessarily know yet. But the thing is, XML really makes your content future-proof because you're able to transform it into anything else. And then flexibility. We talked all about flexibility and what we can do with your information.